Good evening, and thank you for joining us for the Chicago Public Library's Women History Month program. My name is Beverly Cook, and I am an archivist at the Chicago Public Library's Vivian G. Research Collection of Afro-American History and Literature. Tonight's panel discussion, Filling in the Gaps, Black Women and the Rewriting of History, is being co-sponsored by the Special Collections Division at the Harold Washington Library Center and the Vivian G. Research Collection. This discussion will focus on the lives and legacies of librarian Vivian Gordon Harsh and teacher Madeline Morgan, later known as Madeleine Stratton Morris. Both women address historical erasures in public memory and school curriculums, using their profession and passion as a platform for change. Please feel free to post any questions or comments on the YouTube or Facebook chat. Now, I'd like to introduce our two dynamic speakers. First, we will hear from Melanie Chambliss, an assistant professor in the Humanities, History, and Social Science Department at Columbia College Chicago. She teaches courses on 19th and 20th century African-American history and culture. Melanie recently published an article in the Journal of African-American History titled, "A Vital Factor in the Community, Recovering the Life and Legacy of Chicago Public Librarian Vivian G. Harsh," and is now working on her manuscript, "Saving the Race, Black Archives, Black Liberation, and the Remaking of Modernity." Michael Hines is an assistant professor. The second speaker, Michael Hines, is an assistant professor and historian of African-American education at Stanford University. Currently, his research focuses on how African-Americans in the early 20th century created new curricular discourses around race and historical representation. His work has been published in Time Magazine, The Washington Post, and the Journal of African-American History. He has a new book titled "A Worthy Piece of Work, The Untold Story of Madeline Morgan and the Fight for Black History in School," that will hit the stands on May 17. Now, please sit back and enjoy this lively discourse.
Okay, I was on mute for just a second, so give me 1 second to, hold on. Okay, so you all can hear me. All right, great. So first, I'd like to thank the Chicago Public Library and especially the Harsh Collection for sponsoring this program. I'd also like to thank Rosalind Mabry for arranging the discussion and Beverly Cook for not only moderating this conversation, but also helping me with my research on Vivian Harsh and the Hall Library. I look forward to any questions from anyone in the audience, as well as my conversation with Michael towards the end of the program. So my goal for this presentation, under the theme of Black women and the rewriting of history, is to tell Harsh's story and to situate her life and work within the context of my overall project on Black archives as sites of intellectual self-determination. Women like Vivian Harsh, Charlene Rollins, Catherine Latimer, and others enabled and encouraged people to engage with books, manuscripts, letters, photographs, and periodicals by and about African Americans. And I want to use this presentation to think about the process of how that work ultimately contributed to the rewriting and rethinking of history. So to start, in the weeks after Harsh's death on August 17, 1960, the Chicago Defender published a page-long obituary about Harsh where it famously called her a historian who never wrote. That article also included other depictions of Harsh that painted her as an effective but unapproachable leader, and I pulled a few sentences on your screen about the contrast highlighted within her personality. This sense of Harsh's unknowability was the theme I kept encountering in my research, and I realized that that tension between what people knew and what Harsh didn't want people to see was central to her sense of self and even her work at the branch. She, along with Charlemagne Rollins, the Hall Library's much beloved children's librarian, made the branch into a rigorous and reassuring environment that then became an entire community's intellectual center. The George Cleveland Hall Library was founded in 1932, and it was the first full branch to serve Chicago's growing Black population. The branch reached its height during the 1930s to the 1950s during a period later known as the Chicago Renaissance. And as Charlemagne Rollins once wrote in 1942, the branch's readers included every social and economic level, from the successful writer checking material for his latest book to the kitchenette dwelling child who stays every night until 9 o'clock because there's no place at home to read or do homework. Harsh was the Chicago Public Library's first choice to lead this unprecedented and ultimately very popular branch. And I argue that her early upbringing, her professional training, and her personal interests greatly contributed to the library's success. Harsh first joined the Chicago Public Library in 1909, 2 years after she graduated high school, and within a year she transitioned into branch service, which changed the trajectory of her career. What was notable about her decision to work with branch libraries starting in 1910 was that the Chicago Public Library had only just started growing its number of branches within the last 6 years, so Harsh was moving into relatively new territory. That proactive pursuit of advantageous opportunities was a lesson she learned early in life, and I trace that example to Harsh's parents and grandparents who, though born into slavery, tried to advance their place in society during the Civil War and the years after. And so here we see records from Harsh's maternal grandmother, Tennessee Drake, when she enrolled her daughter in the first public school for African Americans in Nashville during the 1860s. And I also found records from Harsh's paternal grandfather, George Harsh, who served as a soldier in the Union Army. Both families also chose to enroll their children at Fisk University in the 1880s, where Harsh's parents, Fenton Harsh and Maria Louise Drake, likely met. Maria joined her husband in Chicago in 1885, decades before the Great Migration, and Harsh would be born 5 years later and raised within that elitist old settlers class, and therefore shaped from birth by this sense of moving with or ahead of the times. And so I have here some photos of a younger Harsh socializing with friends from the personal collection of Harsh's niece, Janice Taylor. And even though these images really showcase a feeling of carefree amusement, Harsh's sense of purpose would have also come from some of these same circles and individuals. From the 1890s to the 1920s, during the same decades when Harsh was growing up, the Black club women movement was thriving as these women engaged in political debates, hosted literary gatherings, opened orphanages, and fought for their own suffrage. Harsh would have undoubtedly been familiar with the activism of Fannie Barrier Williams, a prominent Black Chicago club woman who was also the first Black member of the Chicago Public Library's board of directors before George Cleveland Hall was appointed to the board, for whom the branch was later named. So when I think about the parallels between Harsh's work in this earlier period of activism, these women shared a deep dedication to racial uplift through the cultivation of social and educational spaces. And Harsh continued to favor their style of collaborative activism even as an adult. But in regard to Harsh's role in rewriting history, here Harsh's interests in the Hall Library overlap yet again, because Harsh's love of history, just like her belief in community, existed years before her appointment to the Hall Library. One second. Okay. I argue that because both Harsh and her brother, who were very close, as you see here, were both very reticent about speaking about their family's history, according to Harsh's niece, both Harsh and her brother were likely raised with that same kind of silence as children. If Harsh grew up trying to navigate between what was said and unsaid about her parents' and grandparents' lives in Tennessee, then Harsh's later interest in historical research would have fulfilled a personal longing as the only appropriate avenue for asking questions about the past. So Harsh chose to promote and encourage the study of African American history, even when she herself was more withdrawn and withholding about her own story. So Harsh's passion for history filtered most tangibly into her work with the Hall Library's Special Negro collection. And here are two images of the collection, or what it looked like, at least initially, assumedly sometime around the 1930s when it was a bit smaller. By the early 1940s, 1940s, with closer to 900 non-circulating books in the collection, many groups chose to gather in the library to use its resources. The branch's annual and monthly reports listed statistics for an adult Negro history group, a high school Negro history club, and appreciation hours for children, which introduced Black historical figures. By 1942, 9 schools in Chicago either had their own Black history courses or Black history clubs, and these students needed somewhere to research. Chicago oral historian Timuel Black recalled using the Special Negro collection to complete class assignments while in high school, and another former hall patron remembered attending meetings for DuSable High School's Negro History Club at the branch. So we can also see this collective historical rewriting through the branch's DuSable History Club. This organization sponsored lectures, research projects, and historical pilgrimages, which help library users to construct a new narrative where Black voices and contributions were evident in American and world history, whether in celebrating the Emancipation Proclamation or with the lecture on the bottom right of your screen, discussing African Americans in Chicago from the 1700s to the 1950s. Writer Anna Bontemps once described hall patrons as serious seekers after knowledge, and the librarians were the ones who really encouraged that spirit of inquiry. Chicago journalist Vernon Jarrett once recalled Harsh regularly telling him that he should never apologize for trying to be a scholar. And one of the things that I emphasize in my work is the newness of that right to research, or at the very least, the right and ability to inquire. Harsh once said that the collection's greatest value lay in the opportunity it gave Black people to study their own background and culture. Harsh unfailingly tried to add to the collection by asking booksellers for discounts, rerouting dollars from the library budget, and Harsh was also said to have acquired material during summer road trips across the South. By Harsh's retirement in 1958, the Special Negro collection included around 2,000 books, a clippings file, some pamphlets, a union catalog, research from the WPA-sponsored Negro in Illinois project, and a few manuscript papers. Though this amount was not extraordinarily large in comparison to other Black collections, this was still the largest Black archive in the Midwest, and therefore it was a site that was dually defined by its content and use. So for my final set of thoughts, I wanted to talk a little more about Harsh and my overall book project. As I mentioned before, Harsh joined the Chicago Public Library in 1909, and she was therefore an early example of a professionally trained Black female librarian. Since research is always an ongoing process of discovery, I recently discovered more information about the timeline for Harsh's promotions within the Chicago system. This summer, I was researching in the American Library Association's archives for records about the Hampton Institute Library School, which was founded in 1925 as the first accredited program to train Black librarians in the South. Just before the ALA's Board of Education for Librarianship launched the school, they surveyed other pre-established library programs about whether they had any Black graduates and how those individuals fared in the program. So on this slip of paper on your screen, amongst several other similar pieces in a folder, I discovered that when Harsh enrolled in Simmons College's summer library training program in 1921, she was already the head librarian of the Lincoln Square sub-branch, whereas I previously thought that she first became a head librarian at least 1 year later. During the Q&A, I can go more into what I think happened with this position in relationship to her next role as the head librarian of the Abraham Lincoln Center sub-branch. But I bring up this anecdote because the undertone to the Board of Education's search for these older librarians was whether these Black librarians were capable of handling that work. So while Harsh was not a fantastic student academically, professionally, she proved time and time again that she was more than capable of doing the work. So when I place Harsh's story in the context of my larger project, Harsh was both forerunner of and peer to this new generation of Black librarians that the Hampton Library School graduates represented. By the 1910s, the vast majority of American librarians were women, but we lose track of their voices and interventions when we overly focus on bibliophiles like Arturo Schomburg or historians like Carter G. Woodson or Charles Wesley. Instead, librarians were at the center of a shift towards what was called during the early 20th century, the diffusion of knowledge, or the making accessible of library resources. Although African-American access to public libraries in particular was a slow-moving process across the 20th century, I focus on Black archives as better funded Black libraries that were supported enough to defy those norms and develop their own special Negro collections and related programming. Accessible Black archives emerged during this new era of Black library access as people used these archives to form new ideas, histories, and identities for themselves. And like in the case of the Hall Library, these sites and the librarians who managed them gave users the resources to study history for themselves. They empowered readers like Vernon Jarrett to never apologize for trying to be a scholar, which then gave them the authority even more so to challenge whitewashed histories. Those challenges complicated the expectation that historical truths should be based around consensus when that consensus historically ignored, denigrated, or marginalized Black life. And while Harsh may never have been a historian who wrote traditional narratives, she and her generation of librarians still serve as a major impetus for the rewriting of history today. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions, and I can pass this screen share over to Michael. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Melanie, for the presentation. It was amazing. I learned a ton. Thank you to Rosalind, and thank you to Beverly, and to the Chicago Public Libraries for hosting this event. Again, my name's Mike Hines. I'm an assistant professor at the Graduate School of Ed at Stanford University, where my work focuses on history of education. And I'm here today to talk about a recently finished book project, A Worthy Piece of Work. In the book, I use the story of Madeline Morgan, a teacher activist who crafted and championed the first Black history curriculum to be adopted by the Chicago Public Schools, as a window into Black educational activism and the battle over the history curriculum. It's a story that I think is especially relevant given the ongoing history wars which we find ourselves in today. So in order to locate Madeline Morgan, we need to go back into the stacks of the Hall Branch Library. In the spring of 1941, the Hall Branch would have been buzzing with activity. The library, as we've just heard from Melanie, was a resource for the full width and breadth of Chicago's Black community. And amongst all that commotion, the sight of a quiet, well-dressed local school teacher would have been familiar enough to go unremarked on. But that particular teacher was researching a project that would become a watershed victory in Black education and bring her national and international acclaim. Madeline Morgan, later Madeleine Stratton Morris, was in the process of compiling what would be the first Black history curriculum adopted for use by the Chicago Public Schools, then the nation's second largest school system. From 1942 until 1945, her supplementary units for the course of instruction in social studies were used in 353 elementary and secondary schools throughout Chicago with both white and Black students. Hailed by Fraser Lane, the civic director of Chicago's Urban League, as, quote, one of the finest approaches to improvement in racial relations ever attempted, the units included the histories of West African civilizations and their connections to Black culture in the Americas and elsewhere, depictions of slavery that addressed the horrors of the Middle Passage and the plantation system, and the stories of Black soldiers who valiantly defended democracy even while being denied its fruits at home. It included the biographies of Black artists, politicians, activists, and social leaders, all the way from the nation's founding until the present day. These lessons combated the exclusion and marginalization of Black America found in white authored history textbooks, and they demanded a place for Black history at the center of the American story. As Morgan put it in a note to teachers, the Negro has contributed to every phase of American history. In adventure, science, education, art, music, war, and labor, he has played a part. That message, the unapologetic and unambiguous demand that the full scope of Black agency, beauty, and humanity be included in the education that all children received, helped to challenge dominant narratives and pointed to the possibility of fundamentally rewriting American history. So who was Madeline Morgan? Madeline Morgan was born Madeline Robinson on August 14th, 1906 in Chicago's Bronzeville neighborhood. Her father, John Henry Robinson, had migrated from West Virginia and found work in Chicago as an elevator operator. Her mother, Estella May, was born in the city. The eldest of six, Morgan grew up in a home where education was prized. It was among John Robinson's proudest accomplishments that 5 of his children eventually went on to college, a level of educational access that he had been denied as a child in the Jim Crow South. However, even if Chicago gave Black migrants comparatively better social, economic, and educational prospects, it was still no promised land. As Madeline made her way through school, first at Farron Elementary and then at Inglewood High School, she felt the direct impact of racism and inequality. Majority Black schools like Farron were often under-resourced, lacking basics like dedicated gymnasiums and lunchroom spaces. At Inglewood, which was a predominantly white institution at the time, those resources were present, but Morgan faced ostracization from the white students and teachers. Additionally, she was subjected to a curriculum that was virulently racist and anti-Black. One textbook, for example, The History of the United States, written by white minister and educator Henry William Elson and approved for use in Chicago as late as 1928, told young readers that Black people were biologically inferior, a quote, listless, aimless class who aspire to nothing, who are content to live in squalor and in ignorance. That Reconstruction after the Civil War had constituted a failed experiment in Negro rule and quote unquote unnatural relations between the races. And finally, that the future progress of the country depended on racial separation and the subservience of Black citizens to the benevolent paternalism of white leadership as quote, the Negro is quite safe and his happiness secured under the white man's government. Now, even as a youth, Morgan felt a visceral reaction to such white supremacist propaganda passed off as historical fact. And she decides to become a teacher out of a desire to make sure that no student left her classroom without a thoroughgoing knowledge of Black history. She's able to take that mission further in the early 1940s as Black activism surged during the Second World War and led to a push for rights and representation everywhere from the shop floor to the schoolhouse. Morgan acted on this moment by proposing the first Black history curriculum in Chicago's history, and she succeeded in convincing Superintendent William H. Johnson to devote resources to make that effort a reality. Taking a year off from the classroom to research and write, Morgan utilized resources from across the country and across the city, particularly the Hall Branch Library and its collections on African and African-American history and culture. As children's librarian Charlamagne Rollins noted in the spring of 1941, quote, out of the outstanding activities in which the entire staff was able to participate was the recent project of the Chicago Board of Education. Superintendent Johnson released 2 Negro teachers from classroom duty last year to prepare a course of study in Negro history to be included in the curriculum of Chicago's schools. These teachers worked at the library and with the librarians and the books all year. What emerged from all of that work was a set of social studies materials that Morgan called the Supplementary Units, which was utilized in over 300 elementary and secondary schools in Chicago and quickly became a national sensation. Coverage of Morgan and her work appeared in Black academic journals like the Wilberforce Quarterly, the Journal of Negro Education, and the Negro History Bulletin, as well as predominantly white publications like the Elementary English Review, and even popular outlets like PM and Time magazine. She spoke to audiences in Washington, DC, Detroit, New York, and elsewhere. As a result, she was inundated with hundreds of requests for copies of her curriculum and advice on how to implement Black history programs, both from Black teachers and from liberal white progressive allies. By 1943, Morgan could record that, quote, 40 states have been reached and almost 1,000 sets of units have been mailed since September. Among some of those receiving the units are people as far south as South America, as far north as Maine, as far west as California, as distant as Italy and Africa, and the United States Office of Education in Washington, DC. Boards of education, social agencies, ministers, principals, teachers, soldiers, colleges, city interracial commissions, and interested citizens have all become involved. Through researching and recounting Morgan's story, several key themes emerged for me as a researcher and as an educator. The first was the importance of Black networks of support and sustenance in Black educational activism. I found that Morgan, far from carrying out this work on her own, was part of this large web of intersecting churches, women's clubs, civil rights groups, sororities, and scholarly bodies. She was part of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, the Teaching Sorority of Phi Delta Kappa, the NAACP, the Urban League, and many other organizations. The Hall Branch was a central node connecting many of these organizations and gave her an intellectual community and access to resources that were unavailable within the confines of her own school and even school system. The second theme that emerged for me was the role of interest convergence in curricular change. Black educators have been creating their own historical narratives since the early 19th century. In the 20th, educators from Anna Julia Cooper to W.E.B. Du Bois, Jessie Redmond Fawcett, and Merrill Epps, and of course, Carter G. Woodson, fashioned an alternative Black curriculum in the social studies. Morgan was certainly part of this movement, but her uncommon success hinged not just on her talents as a curriculum theorist and activist, but on the historical moment in which she acted. The Second World War and the racial pseudoscience used by European fascists shone a powerful and a deeply unsettling light on American racial prejudice here at home. Powerful policymakers, eager to draw a contrast between German and American racial views, and eager to shore up racial divisions at home before they exploded and threatened the war effort abroad, were more open to projects like Morgan's than they might otherwise have been. In this momentary alignment between white and Black objectives, I saw an example of what Derek Bell called interest convergence, one of the cornerstones of critical race theory, which posits that political and social advances for Black folk in the US have often been the result of the self-interested actions of those in power working primarily to protect their own positions. The third and final takeaway for me was the difficulty of moving Black history from the margins to the center of the curriculum. Even at its height, the movement for intercultural and interracial education that Morgan took advantage of during the war years was limited in its impact. The vast majority of American schools did not adopt the kinds of reforms that intercultural educators pushed for. And even in cities like Chicago, where such work was able to make real inroads, it met with resistance and with apathy from many white teachers. And as the Second World War ended and the Cold War began, liberal educators came under scrutiny as possibly un-American, which chilled many efforts and attempts to build on the work of Morgan and others in the late 1940s and into the 1950s. A huge challenge to changing the curriculum then is that these efforts need to be deep and sustained in ways that our current system offers few incentives for. Only with that kind of effort can we move Black history towards the center of the curriculum. So as educators continue to fight to bring Black history into the school curriculum, I believe that Madeline Morgan's story should inform current efforts and current activism. My book, A Worthy Piece of Work, is an attempt to contribute to that ongoing conversation. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to questions and our discussion.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Michael, for those wonderful presentations. They're very informative. I also, even though I'm an archivist, learned quite a bit about Madeline Morgan that I didn't know. And thank you, Melanie. I want to again encourage our audience to post any questions or comments that they have on Facebook or YouTube chat. I'm going to start off the questions for some of you folks that are too shy to send them in to us right away. And so I'm going to pose this question to both of you guys. Could you talk a little bit more about your research process in uncovering Harsh's and Morgan's stories? How did your discoveries or frustrations shape your thinking about Black women and the rewriting of history?
Sure, so I can go ahead and get us started. So obviously, a lot of my research started initially looking at the Hall Branch archives. And I think some of the either images or some of the things that I talked about kind of showed some of the range from Nashville to different archives around Chicago that helped me to kind of pull together Harsh's story. But one of the things that I didn't necessarily get to speak about as much was the role of oral histories in trying to bring her story to life. That sense of the limited amount of records that she had, I wouldn't have been able to unpack some of the different directions that I went in the work if it wasn't for the fact that several years ago I had received a fellowship from the Black Metropolis Research Consortium. And in presenting some of my work, someone in the audience had mentioned, like, Clarice Durham, who's the wife of Richard Durham, whose papers are also in the Harsh collection, that she's still alive. And so she then ended up putting me in contact with Timuel Black and Wanda Bridgeforth, and all of these people who were in their 80s and 90s who had experienced the Hall branch, and really helped to bring to life that kind of contrast between the fact that Harsh was this intimidating person, and yet it was unquestioned how dedicated she was to education and making sure that people had access to the resources that she was so diligently trying to collect, along with Charlemagne Rollins. And so I felt like the oral histories, in addition to the archival records, was a little bit more of the research process. And even in thinking about how Harsh's story was simultaneously the preservation of information, and yet she left so few records for herself. I really felt like, as I was telling her story, it was trying to tell the story of Chicago during this era, trying to tell parts of Bronzeville history, Black women's history. And so it felt like it was this community narrative through the perspective of Harsh. And that in some ways feels like, the way in which Black women's history is either thought of or often told, it's this history of the community. And so in thinking about the rewriting of history, it's constantly that push for that collective voice.
I'll jump in there because I agree with Melanie that some of these oral histories are just so key and so important as entry points, and being able to access our elders in the community and really listen to their stories can be the jumping off point for research and for new projects and new ideas. I think for me, when this research began, it was really a legitimate process of discovery. Morgan was absent from the historical record. She was absent from official accounts of Black education in Chicago. And so it was a result, again, of conversations with elders who knew the community and knew this history. On my end, particularly, it was Christopher Robert Reed. As a student, I had read his Black Chicago's First Century and his The Rise of Chicago's Black Metropolis. And I was lucky enough to be able to grab time with him. And he was just such a sort of font of wisdom that I was constantly taking notes as he was talking, just writing down things that might be interesting, things that I might look into. And when he first mentioned that there was a Black history curriculum in the Chicago public schools in the 1940s, I said, that can't be right? That's a decade before Brown versus Board of Education. That doesn't jive with what I know. But I wrote it down, right? And I wanted to look into it. And when I looked into it, I was able to uncover, first going to the Harsh collection, I was able to uncover Madeleine's papers, and I started to dive in, and the research just sort of unfolded from there. I think so. I used, libraries across the city. I've spent a few years pinging back and forth from the Chicago History Museum to the Harsh collection to, Northwestern's archives, Loyola's archives, small libraries like that in Brookfield, Illinois. A couple of trips out there. And then again, on the subject of oral histories, I think one of the best pieces of data for research were the oral histories that are collected in the History Makers archives. So those sites really played an important role for me. And then talking about these women and why they're not in the historical record, there's a historian of African-American history called Pero Dagbovi, who has a term for these women. He calls them historians without portfolio, right? And so there are these women that are out there that are doing the work of history, whether they're archivists or librarians or teachers or social workers, right? But they don't have the portfolio because they don't have, usually the graduate level training, the PhDs in history, right? That are sort of the gatekeeping mechanism to the field of history. And they don't publish usually in the types of scholarly journals that we're used to seeing associated with quote unquote professional historians, right? But these women are the people who are on the ground doing that work and pushing that movement forward. So I think it's really incumbent upon us to pay a lot of attention to their lives and to their careers.
Oh, I think you're muted.
Thank you. We in the profession depend on you in the classroom to push that story, to let people know that they are an important part of history. I think that we need to preserve their papers and that their papers are preserved in repositories across the city. And not only their papers, but the work that they do. Melody, yours was mostly reconstructing Vivian G. by the things that she did in the Hall branch and by the oral histories that you took. I'm looking at our chat and I see that we have another question. What topics do you both feel have significant gaps that you believe the public's input or sourcing could be helpful?
I think, to start, I think that Black women's history still has major gaps, still has major holes that we need to fill. And I think part of that work could be uncovering family histories. That's some work that I've really been wanting to get into more. So family papers, tracing sort of the development of families generation through generation in cities like Chicago. And now that I'm out in the Bay Area, doing that work in Oakland and the San Francisco Bay, I think those family histories are stories that we need to preserve before they're lost, because we have generations that are now passing. And so we need to be really, really keen on gathering those stories and preserving those stories. And that's work that anybody can do, right? So I would encourage people to interview their elders, interview their grandparents, interview their great-grandparents if they're still living, and get those stories down so they can become part of the historical record.
And I would add to that, just thinking about the work of teachers and librarians, and as Michael said, the historians without portfolio, recording stories of impact. Like for all of these people who either engage with the collection or engage with curriculum, like they have stories that may not necessarily be preserved in some of the collections that we've looked at or some of the same materials. And so that kind of shapes the way in which we can think about the impact of their work. The more that we have those stories of people kind of reflecting upon how it benefited them, how it changed their thoughts or their trajectories. So I think that's something in which the public input could easily be crowdsourced and could be helpful for telling these kinds of stories going forward, because there aren't necessarily the records of their work in progress, but there are ways to document that impact.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. How do you see Harsh's and Morgan's work relating to present day debates about critical race theory? Or how would you connect their work to the history of Black studies?
I think as a public school teacher and as a teacher activist, I think I see a lot of connections between the work that Morgan was doing and CRT today. And I want to be careful to define the terms well, because I think that the debate over critical race theory today is only partially about critical race theory. And I think that a lot of times when people use the words critical race theory, it's sort of a thinly veiled way to talk about any curriculum that deals with race and racism in the history of America and American schools. And I think that a lot of times people use that sort of language, that sort of veiled language, because they recognize the power, the inherent power of telling a more truthful, a more accurate version of American history, right? And I think that to me is the through line between what Morgan was trying to do and what critical race theorists are trying to do today, right? Is the attempt to tell a more whole, a more truthful story about America's past. And the fact that they know that in the telling of that story, it demands certain things of us as an audience. It demands certain things of us as listeners. There's no way that you can know the reality of the nation's past, right? And stay silent on certain issues today, right? So, I think that there's an attempt to silence that, and that attempt has been made, in the 90s against multiculturalism, in the 70s and 80s against the emergence of Black studies, in the 1930s and 40s against intercultural education and human relations curricula, right? So this is a story that we've seen over and over again. This is a cyclical sort of culture war that we're engaged in, and a history war that we're engaged in about how we, tell the story of this nation's past. And so I see it as, one in a long line of battles along that same line.
Yeah, I don't have very much to add to what Michael had said about how either similar or how familiar these battles have been. Like, it's always been about the power of exposure. And that was the thing that was so consistent about the work that Madeleine Stratton Morgan was doing, as well as Vivian Harsh. It's this idea that once people have access to this information and these resources, there's no possible way that they could think the same about history. So rather than actually grappling with that reality and changing the ways in which these narratives were told, it's easier to prevent people from having access to that. And so that's the common response we see time and time again.
I would say that some of the most interesting things that were in the Harsh collection dealing with Morgan and with the impact of her work were sort of notes from white teachers who were using her work, especially a woman named Grace Markwell, who was working in Brookfield, Illinois, and who spent a lot of time recording what her students thought about race before using these units, what they thought about it during and even after, right? And in the Harsh collection, there's some letters between students in Markwell's class and Madeline Morgan, asking her to come out and talk to their class, which Morgan, obliges to and actually does. She makes the trip out to Brookfield. And so that, to me, was one of the most interesting parts of discovering this work, was thinking about the impact of white students who, when they first come into contact with Morgan's work, it's not that they don't know Black history, it's that they don't know Black history, and they also don't know that there are Black teachers even, right? And so they're shocked to find that there are Black people who are teachers, and that they write history at the same time, right? So these students are like bowled over by the use of these units, right? And I think that unfortunately, it still happens in many cases today.
Thank you. I have another question. Why did you choose to write biographies of Morgan? You've already answered it to a certain point, but there's more to this question. Why did you choose to write biographies of Morgan and Harsh? What were the challenges and opportunities in writing in this genre, especially for conveying racism and sexism that both women faced during their life and frankly after their death?
For me, the reason why I ended up writing a biography of Harsh is that it originally started as leftover research from my dissertation when I was writing specifically on the Special Negro collection and really trying to define like why these women, Charlamagne Rollins and Vivian Harsh, were so adamant about people having access to these resources. And by the time that I had actually written the chapter, I realized I'd done way too much research into their background. But it seemed like there was still an interesting story that was there that moved them out of the space of just the professional work that they performed, and instead women who lived like these well-rounded lives that could then go into so many different aspects of Chicago, from the 1890s to the 1960s when Harsh died. And so one of the things that I liked about biography as a format was being able to show that context of how Harsh kind of engaged with all these different social factors, all these different communities. And since it ended up being this history that where there were those absences in Harsh's story, then being able to fill in the gaps through either perspectives of other librarians or things that were happening during the time period, it ended up feeling like it was so much more than a biography and representing some of the racism or the sexism that she experienced. Like I had mentioned, the ALA example, of them questioning whether or not it was possible for, to train an entire school of Black librarians and how those graduates had fared. And it's her story in the midst of all of these other voices in that folder that shows that, yes, there is that capability, and that then goes on and becomes this founding generation of Black librarianship. But then there are also examples of the way in which Harsh would write the annual reports, where there was not this sense of, putting too many details about what the branch is doing, but constantly trying to mitigate like how it might be seen downtown versus what was going on in the branch. That there are all these ways in which like her story and the absences within it actually told so much more about what was happening in that moment. So it started kind of as an accidental biography that ended up becoming this much broader story. But I think that genre in general, like in order to tell like the full story of these women who don't get their due, I feel like they deserve the kind of in-depth study that could easily be written biographies of like a Woodson or a Du Bois. And it's not until there is that kind of sustained study of them that we can really start to appreciate to what extent they had that kind of impact in so many different areas.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that, there's, I think Brittany Cooper has a historical triage, because Black women aren't, written about and engaged with in the ways that they should be in history. I think a lot of times what we get are these sort of short little attempts at historical triage of just like bringing our attention to someone and bringing out their accomplishments without going deeper to really engage fully with their ideas, with their life, with the context that's around them. And so I chose biography as a lens, I think like Melanie did for, what she said, that broader context, right? It allows us to see the intersections between sort of human agency and social structures in really interesting ways. I think for Morgan, we can see her sort of personal and professional trajectory against the backdrop of the Great Migration and the Depression and the war years and the Chicago Black Renaissance and the early Black history movement. And, doing biography allows us to like deal with the complexity of those movements through thinking about how one person or a small group of people lived and experienced those moments and reacted to them. So I think that's sort of the reason why I chose biography. To speak to the point of the sexism that both of these women were subjected to within their lives, I found that, even within the Black community and even within the early Black history movement, there was a lot of sexism still just in dealing with that, right? So Morgan, for example, there's an article in the early 1940s about her work. And it covers the fact that the work began with her sorority, Phi Delta Kappa. And it talks about the sorority and Black women's sororities sort of more broadly in this very derogatory way, right? As sort of, these things that only exist to host parties and teas and luncheons, right? And the writer of the article is sort of like amazed that these women, could put down their fancy hats and their teas long enough, right, to, create a curriculum and push for curricular activism. But of course, we know that that's not the case, right? We know that Black women's sororities have always been engaged in educational activism, right? And so any argument to the contrary is, steeped in a lot of misogyny and a lot of sexism, right? And so I find her experiencing that, right, even as she's getting to be more well-known, even as her work is being adopted, people are adopting it, but saying, sort of patronizingly, oh, well, this is great that this little woman, right, this school marm, right, she's called a school marm in a couple of different articles. And even in the Time magazine article about her, the first thing that they say about her is that she's an attractive Negro teacher of 36, right? So again, that sort of sexism, the commenting on her physical appearance before you can even get to, right, the work that she's doing. So I think that factors in, in ways that show up again and again and again in the records.
You're absolutely right. I want to thank you, Melanie, for bringing a little bit of life to Vivian G. Harsh. I know from reading the papers and the reports here and talking to people that went to Hall back in the day, that she was known as a kind of cold and aloof person. And they called her behind her back the lieutenant, as opposed to Charlamagne Hill Rollins, the children's librarian there, who was very outgoing and friendly. I think that history has portrayed her aloofness and coldness as a disinterest, but as you so eloquently pointed out in your article, she is very passionate and very committed and very dedicated to what she was doing. I have one more question for you guys before we close out tonight. It is from, never mind who it's from. The question is, with so little out there about these ladies, how do we get more information on them and get it out to more people?
Well, I definitely think public programming like this one is one of the ways in which you can very easily kind of access what their stories are, as well as the publications, like another plug for Michael's book coming out May 17th. Is that? Yeah, so the fact that there is this turn towards the work of Black teachers, Black librarians, and some of these spaces in which spaces that had historically been ignored within African-American historiography, I do think that there will be more conversations around the work that these women have done. But I think that the more that individual communities can kind of turn to and really celebrate these sites, which were quite often very localized, like in the example of either Charlamagne Rollins or Madeline Morgan, they were able to cultivate a much broader audience. But for the most part, these stories tend to be local histories. I think the willingness to turn and see what existed in your own backyard or in your own city is kind of one of the ways of popularizing these stories as well.
I would completely agree. I think that part of this is about, keeping their memory alive in that local context. And because Morgan was a teacher, I think of things in terms of the schools and curricula. And I know that there's a mandate for students in the Chicago schools to take a History of Chicago course, a semester-long course in the history of the city. And so I would like to see, figures like Rollins and Harsh and Morgan be taught to our students in the Chicago public schools right now, in the secondary grades and the primary grades, so that we can keep that legacy alive.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You guys did a fantastic job of bringing these women back to life for us, for especially so many people who did not even know of their existence. I want to thank the audience for participating with us with these wonderful questions and listening to us. I want you guys to know that this here has been taped and will be available to you later on CPL's YouTube channel. So stay tuned for us. And both of these presenters have left their email addresses or contact information, or you can contact me, Beverly Cook, at the Chicago Public Library. I'm still at 95th and Hostage, y'all. If you have any questions or you want to get in touch with them, I am putting in another plug for Michael's book. I think it's going to be fantastic. I am looking forward to your manuscript, Melanie, and keep up the good work. And keep up the programs. Do you guys have any last comments before we close off?
Just to express thanks again. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to Beverly. And thank you to the Chicago Public Library.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much. It was a wonderful forum. Thank you to Melanie and to Beverly and Rosalind and the entire team at CPL.